This lecture focuses on an introduction to some of the basics of the scientific method. Psychology and social sciences in general are about understanding how humans work. And we need to have strategic methods to understand how we're going to study something. So when we talk about psychologists, and again, your book comes from a psychology perspective, but most of this is true for social sciences in general. They focus on developing theories and conducting research to answer questions about behavior and mental processes, why something does or does not work. So the scientific method is a relatively abstract concept, but it's really about how questions are asked and the logic and methods used to gain answers. So it's a systematic and critical way that we ask questions, and we use logic to try to answer them. So there's two really important aspects. The empirical approach has to do with the fact that we collect data, we observe behaviors directly, we try to systematically control things through experimentation. So we use these kinds of setups to collect data, and that is the empirical approach. We also include a skeptical attitude in the scientific method. We try to use critical thinking, we try to question our findings, come up with alternative explanations. We don't want to just unquestioningly accept what other people have told us or what people tell us is true. When we use the scientific method, we really try to evaluate, is there actually evidence for this? So the kinds of things that social scientists study impact individuals, families, society, public policy. So it's really important that we have carefully designed and executed research. And in addition to trends kind of within our fields, there are reciprocal relationships between research and society. Just an example, in my field, I study peer relationships. And one of the things that we found with regard to bullying is that research shows that it's more than just part of being a kid. You know, we used to have this kind of kids will be kids, you just need to toughen up kind of attitude. But research started showing that being the victim of bullying can have a significant impact on children. This led to greater interest in research as well as in public policy, which led to more funding for research and more detailed questions. So the kinds of research questions we ask can impact the cultural context. It can also impact the resources for science in terms of how much funding there is. It also affects society's acceptance of this research, right? So how much do we accept the general idea that bullying is bad versus the general part of childhood? Because social science research is driven by kind of societal variation, it can also be biased by culture. So most of the social science publications are done by American researchers or North American researchers in similar contexts. So we run the risk of ethnocentrism. And so this is understanding behavior of an individual in a different culture through our own views. So just an example of this, Kohlberg's theory of moral development was developed using adolescent males from kind of American or European backgrounds. And so it holds up relatively well in those contexts, but in more collectivist cultures, it tends to not fit as well. So individuals show on his scales less high moral development. But we think that it's not actually that they're less moral, it's more about the cultural values they've been taught. So we really need to be aware of our cultural influences and ask questions like through a cross-cultural research lens to help us understand. And so ethnocentric bias can certainly influence how we interpret behavior. So we need to be aware of this. Science also happens in a context, and we have standards for integrity and ethical context, or for integrity and ethical conduct of research. But as people who do research for a living, it tends to be very high stakes. Money, promotion, things like that can be on the line for very competitive scientific researchers. And so there sometimes is temptation to violate these moral standards. So violations of scientific integrity include things like faking data, plagiarism, you're going to talk about that this week, selectively reporting findings, so ignoring things that aren't consistent with your theory and only publishing things that are, as well as things like misuse of research funds and unethical treatment of participants. One of the things that kind of helps do this is replication. So if somebody publishes a study, others are encouraged to try to replicate the study and see if they find the same findings. And that can kind of help address, potentially identify some of these moral violations. Okay, in terms of what it means to think like a researcher, there's a couple of things this includes. So one, we already talked about being skeptical. You want to see it before you believe it. Science is a human endeavor, so there's room for error. And so really, you're encouraged to question any new finding. The strongest evidence really comes from converging across different studies that all point to the same general conclusion. It's also really important to be skeptical of the media presentation of research. So if you just read an article on CNN about a new study, it's hard to evaluate how good the research is, and often the description is lost in translation. So one example of this is the Mozart effect. And so this is the idea that listening to music raises intelligence in infants. So if you have your infant listen to music, they're going to be super smart. Classical music, they're going to be super smart later on, right? So this is kind of the way the media has portrayed it. There's been lots of things that have come out because of that, baby Mozart, things like that. The original study that demonstrated this, though, was a study that was done with college students. It was not done with children. It was not done long-term, and the effect only lasted for 15 minutes. That is very different than saying if you play classical music for your baby, they're going to be smart as adults. So thinking like a researcher really means, getting more effective, becoming a more effective consumer of scientific findings and learning how to kind of do it on your own. So another thing is this replication, which I've already mentioned, this converging of evidence. And one way we can kind of think about this is the parallel between science and the legal system. Both of these are kind of set up to make decisions based on evidence. And so in the legal system, a small amount of evidence leads to suspicion. In science, a small amount of evidence can lead us to make a hypothesis. In the legal system, a large amount of evidence is needed to convict. In science, we need a large amount of evidence in order to confirm a theory and to be convinced. So some of the rationale is very similar. Okay, so when you're reading a report of any kind of scientific research, a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. So one is be skeptical, right? You don't just want to believe it because it's published. You want to think about, does it really make sense? And does the evidence support what they're saying? Recognize that scientists may disagree. Just because you're reading one perspective doesn't mean it's what all scientists think. Also remember that research is generally about averages. This is particularly true in social science research, right? So even if we find correspondence between things, it's never 100% of people that follow this pattern. So there may be a relationship or a general pattern, but there's always going to be exceptions. And so it's really important, especially if you're reading media studies, that you go to the original source, right? If you're reading an article on the New York Times about a study that was done, you want to go and actually find the study. And especially as students here, you have access to a whole library full of articles, and you often have online access to a lot of those things. So I really encourage you to go and look yourself. Okay, so when you decide you want to do research, one of the big questions is, what should I study? And normally the first start is reviewing a topic, or reviewing the current literature on a topic. And so this includes academic journals or textbooks, things like that. And it's possible that your research question is already done. This comic kind of depicts that. So this is how happy you are about finding an article relevant to your topic. If you don't find anything relevant, it's kind of sad. You find something perfect. It's getting really exciting. There's lots of interesting research really close. And then, oh no, somebody has actually already done your idea. Now, it can be a little disheartening, but that means that you had a good idea. And often there are multiple ways to address similar questions. Also getting involved in research through talks, working with faculty, things like that. So if this is something you're interested in, I really encourage you to approach faculty and ask what they're working on. So when you're deciding on kind of a research questions, some things to think about. And when you're deciding, is it worth studying? So is it scientifically important? What is the value that we'll get from it? What's the likely outcome? What do you expect to find? To what extent will social science research be advanced by the project? And why would people be interested in the results? And you should be able to come up with justifications for this. Often we get started with a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is a tentative explanation for a phenomenon. And a hypothesis is stated in the form of a prediction and an explanation. So your hypothesis should not be a question, and it needs to describe a specific direction of effect. So as you're and we'll talk about this more a little later, but as you're trying to generate a hypothesis, you're going to think about maybe deviations or exceptions from general trends or principles. You might imagine behavior in a task with a specific problem, or consider similar problems in which a solution is known, or maybe you just observe a person or a phenomenon. You notice a general pattern. You might take from theories or a different discipline. All of these things can kind of get you started on developing your research expectations. We will talk about a lot of different methods in this class, and certainly the trend in research is to really value a multi-method approach. So different areas of psychology and social sciences require multiple methods. There's lots of different research questions and many different methods, and often the best way to get a good answer is to use multiple methods. And so each separate measure you use might be flawed or incomplete, but the flaws in one method might be filled out by another. So just to give you an example, I did a study looking at peer relationships during the transition to middle school, and we asked peers to report on kids' shyness. So who are the shy kids in your class? And we found that generally shyness seems to decrease as kids transition to middle school. And so kids are rated more shy in 5th grade than they are in 6th grade in new school. And one of the challenges of this is, well, its peers are reporting it and they don't know the kid very well when they've just transitioned to a new school. So maybe it's just that the peers have changed. However, we also got self-reports. So the kids told us themselves how shy they were. And we found that the self-reports showed a similar pattern. And so that multi-method approach by using peer reports and self-reports helped us confirm the pattern we were seeing. And so knowing multiple method really gives you a toolbox from which you can choose. Okay, so we will kind of go through the research process or talk about the research process in this class. The general patterns or steps are to develop a research question, then you generate a hypothesis, form operational definitions, so figure out how you're going to assess the things you're studying, pick a design. Are you going to do a correlation or experiment? Evaluate the ethics of your experiment, of your research, collect and analyze the data and form conclusions, and then you're going to report your research results.